The election is days away, and is this the dawning of a bright new future or the death knell for democracy? I'm Adam Epstein, and this is The Dispatch. The election is Tuesday, fellow dispatchers, and it's not just that everything is on the line. Oh, it is on the line. But Tuesday's election will also be a determination as to whether or not we are a nation with majority rule, a fundamental premise that's built into our democracy. Or will we remain a nation ruled by the minority? Which is another way to say that a nation ruled by a minority of its citizens ceases to remain a democratic one. That's a death knell for America, and that's where we are right now, dispatchers. Right. We are being ruled by a minority. The nation is multi-ethnic. It's getting browner, getting less religious, and coming around to progressive positions on everything from universal health care to moving to renewable energy sources, getting off of coal and natural gas, moving towards solar power, and of course, wanting the legalization of weed. Let's do that already, right? But translating this new multi-ethnic majority into a governing majority has been so difficult. Democracy is supposed to be a game of numbers. The party with the most votes wins. Makes sense, right? In our political system, however, the majority does not govern. Constitutional design and our recent geographic trends where Democrats and Republicans live, living in often different places that is, have unintentionally created a mess, sort of conspiring to what is now effectively becoming minority rule, or is minority rule. Our Constitution was designed to favor small and, loosely or low population states. So small states were given representation equal to that of big states in the Senate. So for example, Wyoming has the same number of senators as California. It also gives them an advantage in the Electoral College, as we know. Now, again, when the nation was formed, we had 13 states, and then we moved to 20, and likewise. But as time has evolved and we've led to this sort of population imbalance, there's become a vast overrepresentation of rural states, right? For most of our history, this rural bias did not tilt the partisan playing field all that much because both major parties maintained huge urban and rural wings. So the Democrats always had a city wing and a country wing, and the Republicans had a city wing and country wing. They both did. That's all gone. Today, the parties are very divided, largely actually along urban and rural lines. Democrats have, in the last 30 years or so, become concentrated in big metropolitan cities, where Republicans are increasingly based in what's called, the exurbs, or the sparsely populated red dots you see all over the map. But this gives the Republicans an advantage in the Electoral College, in the Senate, and because the president can select Supreme Court nominees, and then the Senate has to approve them, just the Senate, not the House, the Supreme Court is then chosen by a minority of people. Recent U.S. election results really fly in the face of majority rule when you really look at them. Republicans have won the popular vote for president only once in the last 20 years. And yet, they have controlled the presidency for 12 of those 20 years. Democrats easily won more overall votes for the U.S. Senate in 2016 and 2018, and yet the Republicans still held the Senate majority, currently holding 53 of 100 seats. The 45 Democratic and 2 independent senators, Bernie Sanders of Vermont and Angus King of Maine, who caucus with them, represent more people than the Republicans do. That is, the 47 of them represent more than the 53. Basic math, guys, that's minority rule. An electoral majority may not be enough even for the Democrats to win the presidency on Tuesday. Listen to this. According to 538 and their probability models, if Joe Biden only wins the popular vote by 1 to 2 points, there is still an 80% chance that Trump wins the presidency again. Gulp. If Biden wins by 2 to 3 points, Trump is still likely to win the Electoral College. Biden has to win by 6 points or more to have a near lock on the presidency, like Barack Obama did or Bill Clinton did. Senate elections are similarly skewed. For Democrats today, then, winning a majority of the vote is not enough. We've got more people voting for us, but we don't win. We have to win by these supersized margins, right? Big margins, which have been harder and harder and harder to come by. Yet, if American democracy is nearing a breaking point, the crisis that's been generated by the Trump presidency also might be an opportunity, maybe perhaps a prelude to a new Democratic majority or a breakthrough. Opposition to Trumpism has engendered this growing multiracial majority that could lay a foundation for a more democratic future. Public opinion is definitely tilting left in many ways, very important ways, especially even among white Americans. America's emerging multiracial Democratic majority was very visible this summer in the aftermath of the police killing of George Floyd, which of course galvanized protests everywhere. The killing set off what may be the biggest wave of protest in U.S. history, kind of making the 60s even seem small by comparison. An estimated 15 million to 26 million Americans took to the streets and protested, and that was in small towns everywhere, rural America, all 50 states and all territories. 3/4 of Americans supported the protests in June, and large majorities, and that included 60% of whites, 6 out of 10 whites, supported the Black Lives Matter movement. These numbers declined a bit over the course of the summer, of course, but as of September, 55% of all Americans, and that included 45% of white Americans, continue to support Black Lives Matter at levels that were considerably higher than ever before, especially back in 2014 when BLM was formed in the wake of Trayvon Martin's murder. But this is why Mr. Trump's efforts, or President Trump, I shouldn't call him Mr. Trump, his efforts to resurrect Nixon's silent majority appears to have failed. Remember that whole thing for the suburbs? I did an episode on that. The majority, not seeking a old-fashioned racist return to America's white past, its racially exclusionary past, but making steps toward its multiracial and probably democratic future, seems to be simpatico with the protesters, right? Everybody sees a new America emerging. But the problem is exacerbated again and again by Republican efforts to dampen turnout, right? To suppress the vote among younger, poorer, lower income, and minority voters especially. Republican state governments, for example, have purged voter rolls, closed polling places on college campuses, and in predominantly, shocker, African American neighborhoods. And since 2010, a dozen Republican-led states have passed laws making it so difficult, incredibly difficult, to register a vote for people of color. Minority rule has basically skewed the entire composition of the Supreme Court too. We've just lived through that. Under Trump, Neil Gorsuch and Brett Kavanaugh became the first 2 Supreme Court justices in history to be appointed by a president who lost the popular vote. That's right. And then be confirmed by senators who represented, get this, less than half the electorate. Now Amy Coney Barrett is the third. In a 52-48 vote, she's there for life as of this past week. In America today, then, the majority doesn't govern, alas. This broken system is crying out for reform. Here we are a weekend before the election. If we insist on being a democracy, we need to act like one. And guess what? There is ample precedent to change things in America, for democratic seismic shift, small d, reform in our system. A century ago, just like today, the United States was experiencing a very, very profound time of economic change, a disruptive time. An influx of migrants from Europe were coming in. There was the growth of what are now essentially corporations. And citizens believed that their country, their political system, wasn't answerable to them anymore. It had become corrupt and dysfunctional. Progressive reform advocates everywhere were arguing that Americans were living in a democracy with antiquated institutions designed for a different time. 18th century America, farming, agrarian society, which it radically changed. It left our system, even 100+ years ago, ill-equipped to cope with the problems of a new industrial age and very, very vulnerable to capitalist corporate exploitation. The response was amazing, right? It was a sweeping reform movement that made our democracy, and remade it actually, fundamentally shaped or reshaped. Key reforms that were regarded as super radical then, things that, we get consumed by now, were taken for granted now, right? All sorts of things, including the introduction of party primaries. They didn't exist before then. The expansion of the idea of a referendum on a ballot. You can choose local issues, all sorts of things affecting your state. And constitutional amendments were added, allowing, get this, a national income tax. We didn't have that before the 20th century. The direct election of U.S. senators, also. State legislatures used to vote for your senator. You didn't have a vote. Imagine that. There was an electoral college, and you didn't vote for your senators. Well, that changed in the early 20th century, and the right of women to vote. Suffrage. Okay? American democracy thrived in the 20th century, in part because those first 10 or so years decided to reform itself, underwent a significant change for the better. Now, critics of reform today assert that all these counter-majority institutions, so in other words, minority rule basically, are essential to liberal democracy. Well, we agree. We don't want a tyranny of the minority. You know, that's what the Bill of Rights protects. First 10 Amendments of the Constitution make sure minority rule isn't overrun, and that's why we have judicial review, the idea that Congress can pass a law and the courts can weigh in on it. And also, we want to ensure, of course, that individual liberties and minority rule as a whole are always safeguarded under majority rule. But disenfranchising people is not a feature of modern liberal democracy, nor should it be. No other established democracy has an electoral college or makes regular use of the filibuster in the Senate, right? They just choose their candidate. They go and vote. The majority wins. And a political system that repeatedly allows a minority party to control the most powerful offices in the country is not a legitimate one. And it can't remain one. So, here we are, a few days out from the election. A Democratic reform agenda, along for whatever else can happen under a potential Biden presidency, should offer a few things. District of Columbia, Washington, D.C., and Puerto Rico should be made states. Right? Those are American citizens. That would provide full and equal representation to about 4 million Americans who currently are disenfranchised. Their vote does not count. And it should include, yes, it should include the elimination of the Electoral College. The House of Representatives last voted in favor of a constitutional amendment on the Electoral College in 1969, but the proposal died in the Senate at the hands of old segregationist senators. James Allen of Alabama, Southern segregation at the time, said, quote, "The Electoral College is one of the South's few remaining political safeguards. Let's keep it." In fact, the Electoral College was created to protect slave owners and their slaves, to count them as part of the population and determining the majority way back when. Yeah. So now, we got to get rid of minority rule. It is not inherently democratic. But importantly, we also have to encourage the Republican Party to abandon its destructive course. It's a radical course. Normally, political parties change course when they lose elections. Not the Republicans. In America, there is a hitch. Republicans know and have known, especially in the last decade, but even before that they can win and exercise power without ever building a national electoral coalition, a national majority. It's excessively counter-majoritarian, meaning against the majority. And those institutions that they've taken control of really impede change. They stand in the way of what an American electorate, changing and growing and ever dynamic, wants. As long as the Republicans can hold on to power without broadening beyond their shrinking base, they will remain prone and more than willing to the kind of extremism and demagogy that you see all the time that threatens our democracy. Threatens it to the core. But it's up to us. Voting. And voting at every level is a must. The presidential election is already setting, as we sit here, records with voter turnout. As of this episode, 90 million Americans or so have voted. Turnout is bound to be huge on Election Day. But turnout needs to be big, always, and not just in presidential election years, dispatchers. The 2018 midterms was the highest turnout for a midterm in almost 100 years. And the Democrats scored a huge win, capturing 40 seats in the House of Representatives, the biggest since Watergate, and reclaiming governorships in Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania. You know, those 3 states that are key this year to the election that Trump won in 2016 and catapulted him to the presidency, albeit narrowly. But saving democracy is work, and voter participation levels, especially in the midterms, has historically been low. And of course, for state legislature races too. They've been non-existent, allowing the Republicans to move in, show up to vote, and control from a minority perspective. But there is no longer a choice. Tuesday can be a day of reckoning, either towards the sun or towards the darkness. The choice this year isn't over taxes or defense spending or trade policies, though Trump's failed trade war with China is certainly on the ballot, as are the rest of his failed policies. No, this year, your lives do depend on the vote. It is the most important election of your life. You've heard that your whole life, but now this one is. And after a tumultuous year of a pandemic that ravaged the nation and the world, racial protests had exploded across America, and the deep fissures which had been exposed at the core of the American system, it's not only about voting for change. It's also about voting for truth. If the people speak up, that is, the majority of people, we can still fight for our yet-to-be-realized and all-inclusive democracy and not slip into our twilight years as a nation, as an autocracy with minority rule. As Bernice King, daughter of Martin Luther King Jr., tweeted just this week, something that has been made clear, she wrote. We need to stop saying, quote, this is not who we are in America. Indeed, this is not who and what the United States should be, she continued. But denial won't make the injustices and inhumane ideologies less so. We can't change without truth. Amen. Now, go to vote to save the Union Tuesday. Save the Union from itself. I'm Adam Epstein, and this is The Dispatch.